Hello, my name is Abby and I'm the head of school here at Barcelona Montessori School. I wanted to talk to you today about how we incorporate Castilian Spanish and Catalan into our language program in our primary school. For the remainder of this PowerPoint, when I say Spanish, I'm referring to Castilian Spanish, just so that's clear. So, what will I talk to you today? It's quite a long one, so get some popcorn, take a comfortable seat. Today we are going to go through, first of all, how we do this in Spanish and Catalan right now, in both our lower primary and our upper primary classes. Then I want to talk a bit about why we do this in terms of the legal requirements, why we've chosen to combine PE and Spanish, a bit about the history of the school, so you can those of you who are newer can have some context, and then a bit about the Montessori philosophy and child development, and finally some experience from our team who have worked at different schools offering various linguistic programs. Then I'm going to talk about what will change next year, which includes some information about the extra Spanish and Catalan classes we've talked about, and about how you can support your child. Before we get started on all of those topics, I just would like to clarify a point. I think what we would like you as parents to understand is that when you ask us a question, we do listen. In this case, a parent raised a question on a concern that they had to administration. They'd also raised it to the guides, and we suggested to that parent, because they said there was a group of parents involved, that they raise this to the parent reps. Now, that didn't mean that we dismissed their concern, but what we did was just ask generally amongst other members of staff if they'd heard similar things. That parent raised the concern to the parent reps, and it was brought up in a meeting. At this point, we know or have a better idea of how many families are involved and how much of a problem this is. And so what the school does is take that information and review it. And what we look at is the perception or the concern that's raised by the parents, what they see as happening. And then we look at what's maybe actually going on to make sure if there is a discrepancy there. Because we know that sometimes we don't always communicate everything we do as well as we could. And so the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're all coming from the same point of view and wanting, and we've understood as well the concern that the parents have and what sort of changes they'd like to see. And then we look at the context within which this is operating. How many children involved, how many classrooms might be affected by this issue. And once we have an idea of what's going on, we look and we meet and we discuss the options for change or growth. And this is taken from the stance of the individual child, because we always try to keep the child at the centre of what we do. And once we've looked at the individual child or the individual children involved, we look further on. We look at what is suggested by the Montessori philosophy. We look at our legal position as a school, as a business, any insurance issues that might be involved, and our responsibility for education. We look at timeframes. When might parents be able to see any changes that they're suggesting? How quickly does this need to be resolved? Is it something that we can resolve simply, or is it something that will take several years? We then look at budgets for this year, for following years. And finally, we look at the effect of any changes on our community as a whole. And then finally, we make a decision. And I want this to be very clear for everybody. This decision comes from the school administration department. That does not include investors. We have a board of investors, but this is a silent board of investors. They do not take decisions that are based on the day-to-day running of the school. They take decisions on bigger budget issues and direction for school growth, but not normally on ones that are brought up during parent rep meetings. And in particular, any parents who have or family community members who have lent money do not get a say in the decision making of the school. And we know that this is something in the past which has put people off lending money perhaps, but unfortunately as a school, fortunately or unfortunately, the decision was taken that we wanted to ensure that we had we could maintain as a school administration the decision-making process without pressure from investors or lenders to move us in a particular direction. Now I'm going to pass you on to Celia, who is our current Catalan teacher, but next year will be the Spanish and Catalan coordinator, and she is going to go through with you how we do Spanish and Catalan now in our primary department.
Well, how do we do Spanish in Catalan now? Students in primary are currently doing the following activities in Spanish and Catalan. They have 2 hours per week of physical education and Spanish with Diego. They also have 2 hours per week of project-based learning in Catalan and cultural studies with Celia. Music activities are held along the week in Spanish and Catalan in the school. Swimming lessons are given by local staff in Spanish. We do different going outs and coming ins, both in Spanish and Catalan. For example, we visit the local public library and market. We went sailing or did fencing at the local sports centers, just to name a few. We also do excursions and day trips. For example, the visit to the Bosque Vertical at the beginning of the school year and the colonias at the end. Then, during lunchtime, the monitors and kitchen staff speak Spanish to the children. So what do we do and how do we do Catalan and Spanish in lower primary? In lower primary, we focus on oral and listening comprehension skills first, especially the first 2 years of primary. Just to give you a few examples, in Catalan, we do different projects throughout the year. For example, the market project, that, as you will see later, the activities are related to this project are not only based on food, but also related to nutrition and healthy habits. Or for example, International Women's Day, which we work for a whole month actually. In Spanish, in lower primary, we start focusing on instructions, understanding and following them. Also to play different games. And we promote to play those games during playtime. The high-level second years and third years are introduced in both languages, the sentence building and structure. We also introduce reading comprehension activities and more written activities too. In Catalan, there is a more developed written work, reading and spelling activities relating to cultural and geographical studies. That's when we start learning about maps and the geography of Spain and Catalonia. In Spanish, there is also a more developed written work, reading and spelling activities relating to physical education. As you can see in this slide, there are some examples of PE activities in Spanish. In the first 2 photos, the children plan and then write instructions. They plan a whole PE activity, which is later put into practice by the students themselves with their peers. Here we can see some examples of Catalan activities in lower primary. The first photo is about written vocabulary after they learned the names of the continents and where to place them. This activity was related to a little project about the Olympic Games we did at the beginning of the school year. Then in the second picture, you can see an activity linked to the local market project. It is actually about nutrition, where the children had to plan a healthy meal, a healthy plate. This is actually a reading comprehension and vocabulary activity. And in the third picture, you can also see an example of a vocabulary and written activity. In upper primary, we focus on the 4 main skills of language learning, which are local, oral, listening, reading comprehension, and writing. We keep carrying a wide range of events and studies throughout the year related to different festivals. For example, Christmas, Carnival, Sant Jordi. There is a continuation of cultural and geographical studies. Then in upper primary, we introduce some grammatical and spelling rules in Spanish and Catalan. Also, we continuate the cultural and geographical studies. We go a little bit deeper into the knowledge of Spain and Catalonia. And we also introduce the digital literacy in Catalan and Spanish. For example, the use of online dictionaries, soft Catalan. What we do not encourage is the use of Google Translator. And here you can see some examples of activities in upper primary. The first two photos, you can see students preparing a whole PE session in Spanish, which includes the planning before the session and the carrying of the session. They are in charge. And in the third photo, you can see an example of a reading comprehension activity in Spanish. Here you can see just a few examples of Catalan activities in upper primary. The first photo on the left is a reading comprehension activity. The second one, as you can see, is related to the grammar. This is one of the grammar boxes the children do during the school year. And the last photo is an example of a research done by a small group of students about the Paralympic Games.
Thank you, Celia. Now I just want to talk a bit about why we do this in terms of the legal requirements. And the first point I want to make sure that everybody is clear on, because I know that when I first arrived in Barcelona, I was not so clear on this point. And it's to do with the importance of Catalan in Catalonia. And as a school, we are a school in Barcelona, which is in Spain, but we are in the autonomous community of Catalonia. And there is a law that was established back in 2009 that establishes Catalan as the main language of instruction in schools in Catalonia. Now, that means if we were to be a school that was only authorised by the Generalitat or the Consortium of Education, then we would have to teach primarily in Catalan. As we want to teach in English, we must register ourselves as an international school, where English is a majority language. But as a school in Catalonia, we still have to teach Catalan. We cannot be a bilingual school of only English and Spanish. We have to teach Catalan as well. And you'll see more about this in just a moment. So in terms of the authorizations that we have, that we could have, if you look around, most trilingual projects within the city offer approximately 33% of English, 33% of Catalan and 33% of Spanish. And these are all schools that are authorized by the Consortium de Educación. Our school is not authorized only by those. We have the homologation, which means that students are learning Catalan and Spanish and will receive a certificate from the Consortium de Educación when they turn 16. But our school is mainly inspected by NABS, which is the National Association for British Schools in Spain. And they require that we teach the majority of our curriculum in English. They give us the accreditation through the British Council, but I just want to make it clear that the British Council does not inspect schools in this way. Equally, as a school that is forever growing, we are often asked by families, how can you prove to us that you're doing a good job? Because one of the things with Montessori is we're not big on exams. And even if we were, our children are too young to take exams. So having listened to these concerns that you raised in the past, what we've done is look at other accreditation organisations who can accredit the school's work that we're doing and tell you, yes, we think that they're doing a good job. Now, many accreditation agencies look at things like interactive whiteboards and the number of iPads that are available to students and the number of computers that are available to students. As a Montessori school, we don't want our school to be accredited based on those things because we don't want to have a minimum number of those in our classroom that gets higher and higher each year. It's not our way of teaching. So we've looked at certain accreditation bodies that we think would be useful for our school. And the ones that we've looked at require us to teach a minimum of 50% in English. Most international accreditations require this, with a minimum teaching in core subjects like English, maths and science. And we double checked with our NABS inspector just to make sure that we weren't missing something in terms of being able to teach more in Spanish and less in English. And what our inspector said was, sadly, you would most certainly fail the next inspection. I have no idea who they spoke to at the British Council, but for sure it was not the British side. Lessons other than languages must be taught in English. So that's referring to the Spanish and Catalan. We follow BSO, which is British Schools Overseas, which is the educational act, which you can look up through the government website. This is dangerous for your school. So that's why for the moment we are not exploring a trilingual model at school. We will teach all three languages, but our majority language will continue to be English so that we carry on passing our accreditation inspections in the coming years. The next topic I just want to briefly address is a question raised by families. Why do we do this in PE and Spanish? Why do we combine the two? The main reasons are the following. You're probably aware that PE generally takes place outside of the classroom. And this is an advantage because that way we can promote the use of Spanish during PE lessons without it becoming something that the children get used to doing within the classroom setting. When we used to have our Spanish classes and Catalan classes mixed into our work cycle, it got very confusing for students what language they were speaking at what particular time. So for us, it's good to have PE outside of the PE is something outside of the classroom where we can promote the use of Spanish. Also, because speaking Spanish in PE fits with the following: the requirements from our inspectors, who don't want children to be using Spanish in the classroom. Swimming, our swimming lessons tend to be in Spanish or sometimes Catalan, as teachers speak. And Spanish is the language of the playground. Even in Barcelona, where Catalan is taught as a majority language in schools, Spanish is the language of the patio. And as we are promoting sports during patio time, it makes sense to us to promote the use of the Spanish language at that time. And finally, it avoids us banning Spanish. You might be aware that many schools where English is a big focus in the school, they have a ban on Spanish during non-Spanish class time. So children have to speak in English during class time or perhaps at lunchtime. We had a long discussion with the inspector about why we don't do this. And basically, to summarize, it's in order to avoid students developing a dislike for Spanish, for English, because we're stopping them from talking in their mother tongue a lot of the time. But it's also because we like the fact that our students are multilingual. The majority of our students speak more than one language. And this is something that we want to promote amongst students. And therefore, language switching is something that they need to get used to doing. And we want to allow for that across the school. Now I'm going to pass you back to Celia, who's going to talk a bit more about the guidance for our educational project.
Why do we do this, the educational project? As a school in Catalonia, we must have an educational project. We must propose flexible and creative learning environments, a variety of options to appropriately address the educational and social needs of all of our students, respecting the different working paces and designing activities and materials that enable the progress of each student. What are the legal requirements? Throughout the whole primary, the students are required to study 525 hours of Spanish language and literature and Catalan language and literature. This is approximately 2.3 hours of each language per week. It can include trips and other activities, such as the ones we do in our school. in our program, our educational project was approved by the Consorci d'Educació, and it is inspected annually. In order to give you a bit of information about how the curriculum works, the Catalan curriculum is actually called Decret 17/2022. It has 8 key abilities or competències clau, of which as an international school, we work on 2 of these in Spanish and Catalan. One is the language ability and the other one is multilingual awareness and use of language. Then, from those key competences are derived different areas of knowledge or subjects, àrees de coneixement. We do 2, the Catalan and Spanish language, and the natural, social and cultural knowledge, coneixement del medi natural, social i cultural. Within each of these 2 areas, there are skills or competences associated to them. And in order to achieve the requirements of the curriculum, we also need to take into consideration the benchmarks or sabers distributed throughout the 6 years. Therefore, when the teachers design their units, projects and activities, they need to look at the sabers, but also bear in mind the competences and key competences as well. Here you can see some examples of sabers or benchmarks. At the end of primary, year 7, the child needs to show interest in oral expression with the correct pronunciation and intonation in any given situation. Another example would be to apply different strategies to detect discriminatory language in any given context. And use of the school and local library as a space of shared literary activities and as part of community reading activities. All of this is assuming that the child enters the school in primer de primària, year 2, and remains in our school until sisè de primària, year 7. The new students and the students with special educational needs receive, both in Catalan and Spanish, differentiated activities and assessment strategies within the same classroom. Because as the Decret 150 2017 or inclusion degree establishes, long-term use of differentiated classrooms are not recommended.
Thank you, Celia. I'm going to come back to you now, and I'd like to talk a bit about the history of the school so that those of you who are newcomers have some context about the decisions that were made and why we are where we are today. So, as you know, we opened the school back in September 2020, and at that point we were just coming out of COVID, and you will remember that there was very little migration. And therefore Spanish was the main language spoken between families in the school. That's not to say that most of our families and all of the parents were Spanish native speakers, but at that point the concern was raised by parents about what they perceived as a very low level of English amongst the students. I think it's also worth mentioning that at that particular point our student body was generally younger, and so their language ability was lower in all ages. At that point, Spanish and Catalan were taught during the work cycle by a separate guide, and this caused a number of difficulties. Our students spoke more Spanish than English during the work cycle a lot of the time because these lessons were going on and things were becoming very mixed up. And a big problem in Montessori was that our curriculum became segregated and flow was interrupted. And we also had a criticism from our inspectors, which was due to the fact that we were teaching Spanish during our work cycle. So by mid to late 2022, migration was beginning to become more part of the city again. We were all beginning to feel more human. And English became a major language of communication amongst families. Again, our body didn't change enormously. We still had families that were where generally one parent spoke Spanish, and Spanish was a language of communication amongst families, but parents began more and more regularly to communicate in English. Also partly because the school made a drive to remove Spanish as a communication method in our newsletters and other emails. And at that point, Spanish and Catalan were moved as to separate subjects in the afternoon with an emphasis in other areas to ensure exposure. And since 2024 up until now, we've noticed a drop in the number of Spanish passport holders of about 7% since 2023. So why do we do this? Now, most of you have been to a talk where you've probably seen this planes of development. Certainly if you've joined the school in the last few years, you'll be familiar with this. And Montessori talks about the 4 planes of development, as you know, and how each plane was characterized by a sensitivity. So in infancy, we have sensitivities that are movement, language, order, whereas in childhood, you will notice that the sensitivity for language is no longer there. Now, I think it's important that you understand sensitivity as an interest, an innate interest that the child has. That doesn't mean that the child becomes unable to learn a different language or to learn a language, but it's just that period of sensitivity has closed. So the child's focus will shift away from language and perhaps onto morality and justice. And this is important to bear in mind when we're looking at the primary age child. Also particularly because it's important to bear in mind that the sensitivity for language at that time is verbal. And this comes up if you look for literature about language learning. One of the things that they don't tell you very explicitly, but is that most studies are about language learning, oral language learning, verbal language skills, rather than written language learning. Okay? I also want to draw your attention to 2 areas on this chart that are called developing and consolidating. And you will see this developing and consolidating triangle come up in all of the stages. It's important to bear in mind that during those periods of time, your child, where it says developing, your child is basically taking in a lot and not giving out much. And so what I often say to parents is this is the time of questioning, and you really begin to question the Montessori method. And those of you who have children who have gone through the 0 to 6 phase, you might be able to remember back to the 0 to 3 if you were in Montessori at the time and remember that you wondered to yourself why on earth you were trying to do this stupid Montessori with a child who just keeps spilling water all over the place when they're trying to pour from a jug into a glass. That was one of the questions I asked myself at the time. Why was I doing this? Because I was constantly having to tidy up extra things, because they were developing those skills. And as your child begins to consolidate them and you see that your 4-year-old is really able to pour a glass of water wonderfully compared to their peers of a similar age who haven't had that practice, you begin to think, oh, maybe it was worth it all. But what we do notice is that 6 to 9 period, because it's a period of developing a lot of things, it's a period of silent work. And so a lot of the time, and this is the same for maths, for language, in English, and other areas, we don't see the work that is going on become more explicit until they begin to enter the 9 to 12, at which point, even the first year, a lot of it is not very open and obvious, but you might suddenly see a jump. A bit like when a child is learning to walk, they don't sort of take one step one day, 2 the next, and 3 the following. It tends to go not in a linear pattern, like which would be much more convenient for the observing adult. It tends to go in leaps and bounds, and then silent for a while. So this is also something to bear in mind about what Montessori tells us when we're thinking about language development. What Montessori also tells us is about how we have to isolate the difficulty. And for those of you who have children who have been through Children's House and primary or in primary, you will probably recognise this as the stamp game. The stamp game allows us to isolate the difficulty of understanding how to add, subtract, multiply and divide, because the child isn't having to keep numbers in their head while they're doing it. They're not having to do small calculations all the way through. What they're doing is setting up a problem and understanding very clearly how you are solving that problem step by step. Part of this helps to reduce frustration. And this is key, I guess, to what Montessori tells us. We are not trying to put children to the test all the time and get them to show us what they can do, which is also why we require children, when they join the school, to have a basic level of English. We don't expect a child to be learning English and learning to add, subtract, multiply and divide while they're still learning the numbers. And this is another reason why we wouldn't want to incorporate activities into the work cycle that are Spanish and Catalan, particularly for those newly arrived, because rather than necessarily making them learn the language much more quickly, what it can do is create moments of frustration where they're unable to get to the new activity that they're doing and unable to understand it simply because they don't understand the language. And you can see this this is discussed in various scientific papers, where you see that children aren't able to meet the learning outcomes, we'll discuss this further, because they're done in another language. And this relates to the deep understanding of language that students begin to develop as they move into primary. We're not only talking about a basic verbal skills in a language, we begin to analyse sentence structure, we analyse poetry, and if we're doing this in lots of different languages, particularly for those students who are newly arrived in Spain or in Barcelona who don't speak Spanish and Catalan, it's very challenging to do those kind of activities while you're still gaining a grasp of the language. I'd like to just briefly show you this diagram, which is Montessori's view of the cosmic education. And this was her view of the curriculum and how a way of showing how everything is intertwined. And you can see that there's a lot of arrows and it's circular. We're not having things divided up into blocks, which we often see when we look at a more traditional curriculum. And this all relates to flow within the classroom. Subjects flow into each other, and there are links created between different topics and different subject areas. If we start to divide this up into different languages, we will lose the flow of the classroom, because unless we are working in an entirely truly trilingual environment where all staff and all students are fully trilingual, switching between those languages is very difficult initially, which is why we stick to one language in the classroom in a Montessori environment. And if you look into it, you will be able to find there are numerous seminars, numerous moments where even truly bilingual societies, so for example, bilingual as in Spanish and Catalan, they discuss the difficulty of having those two languages in the classroom and how that interrupts. So if you're adding a third where the children have varying differences in the fluidity of those different languages, it becomes very challenging overall for the staff and for the students, and particularly if what we're dealing on that basis is non-native speakers or people who don't have necessarily the highest level. Because if we have a native speaking English teacher, we often get ours from outside of Spain. Not always, some of our teachers are fluent in all languages, but it's extremely complicated to manage that and without disrupting the flow with when you have two languages. But when you're adding a third, it becomes even more difficult. So while traditional classrooms deal with that problem by segregating languages into hourly blocks and having different people do different languages and therefore different topics, so some schools might do maths in English or they might do science in English, when we do that within a Montessori environment, we really disrupt the flow. And in all honesty, if it was a bilingual environment of Spanish and Catalan, it's something that we as a school might consider because there are similarities in the language. But really, we don't want to offer you something false that we know that we're not going to be able to do, which would be a trilingual school in this sense. It would also take away from the time that children have to explore, because they're having to learn a lot of different vocabulary to a high degree in the different languages. And we know that this could affect the motivation that students have behind the learning, because when we're learning another language, we need to have a reason to want to learn it, a social reason. And this is very important within Montessori. So why do we do this, and what other studies and evidence we have about this? And this information is provided by Laura, who's our curriculum coordinator for primary. So if you have any questions about that, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any that you have. So what do we know? In early childhood, which goes from in Montessori 3 through to 7 years old, which is the beginning of primary, but it's still considered early childhood, there is an oral focus. And during these years, children's brains are very plastic and receptive to language learning. And you can see that most studies will tell you that children are able to learn a number of different spoken languages, and that it has many benefits. We see a greater ease of pronunciation and vocabulary. And there is a discussion at the moment about how much there is interference and whether this interference is a problem. But anybody who has children who are learning several languages will tell you that there is a level of interference that goes on. But because the children are young, they are less socially aware, they're not in a social period, they're not so bothered by their mistakes. And so this curiosity that they have and their ability to recognize linguistic patterns, this interest, this natural interest that they have, can mean that these linguistic patterns in the long term don't interfere with the development of what would be considered the mother tongue or the main language. And this is crucial when we're avoiding overwhelming students. So young students orally and verbally are good at learning languages. When it comes to writing, we tend to introduce it only in one language, and we'll talk a bit more about that now. So from around the age of 7 or 8, if a child is exposed from a very young age to several languages, so I'm talking from infancy, 1 or 2 years old, maybe 3 max, by the time they get to 7 or 8, they will be consolidating their verbal skills. But you know that even a 7 or 8-year-old child isn't speaking necessarily brilliantly the whole time. They might be losing their teeth, so they might lisp. And we know that talking affects a lot how you read and how you spell. So when we're beginning to learn to read and write, we take into consideration a lot how the child talks. So if your child is having difficulty with learning to read and write, you might hear from the teacher that we suggest some speech therapy or practice with pronunciation first. But around 7 to 8 years old, if children are already learning to read and write in one language, they will begin to consolidate their reading skills around these ages. And according to studies that revolve around second language acquisition, reading and writing in a second language around 7 to 8 years old is ideal because children have got the cognitive skills to approach literacy. And at this age, they already have a basic proficiency in their mother tongue. If your child is a bit slower on learning to read and write in their main language, it would be advisable to not push too much the introduction of that second language. But when we do begin to introduce reading and writing, we start on a basic level with words. We don't go straight into sentence structure. We start by learning how to spell words and use the skills that we have in our mother tongue and apply them to the new one. And there's a study, if you look, by Janice 2008, or I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing that right, Genesis, that states that the consolidation of language skills in the mother tongue should be a prerequisite before introducing a second language, especially when regarding reading and writing. Now, around the age of 9 to 10 years old, in terms of cognitive and linguistic development, children can handle multiple languages more flexibly as their brains have matured enough to manage these reading and writing in different languages. And introducing languages in terms of reading and writing at this point can be beneficial for consolidating and expanding their linguistic repertoire. You may have heard Montessori teachers and guides suggesting to you that you read to your child books that are slightly above their age, their reading ability. So if a child is reading around the age of 6, and they're reading basic books, you can read slightly more complicated books to them to increase their word knowledge. And research shows that at this stage, the brain can process sounds and grammatical structures more effectively and facilitate the acquisition of written language. Now, some experience from our team. As you know, our team come with a number of years' experience behind them, and somebody who's recently arrived from Switzerland is Paulina, and she looked horrified when I mentioned the idea of a trilingual Montessori environment because she worked in a trilingual Montessori school, and she has some experience from those areas of the difficulties that they faced on a day-to-day level. And so Paulina mentions the fragmented language development that can happen but when we're sacrificing depth for breadth. And she says, especially in Barcelona, where English, Catalan and Spanish are relevant, schools may need to prioritize one language based on their community needs. Because if we're doing everything in 3 languages, we won't be able to do as much as when we do it in 1. She also wanted to note the peer influence is uneven but powerful. And where in classrooms where few children speak the targeted languages at home, and as we are a school within Barcelona and Spain, the majority of our students will speak, and the majority of international schools, in fact, in Barcelona, the students speak Spanish or another language that is not English at home. It means that meaningful acquisition of English will depend on social motivation. And if a child has got no personal incentive to use the language, for example, in play, friendship, or just genuine interest, language exposure will remain superficial. And we can often see this with children who, when they first arrive in the city, a tendency is to want to interact with parents or between parents where language is easy. And if you're an English speaker, it's very easy because most people speak your language. We're lucky in that sense, but it can make us lazy, and I speak from experience. So it's really sufficient for one of the guys to be the only transmitter of the language through presentations alone. And this limited context does not provide enough depth, frequency or motivation for a child to acquire the language fully or become fluent. So what we want is to ensure that these children have the opportunities to interact with each other in those languages, which is why our work cycle is in English, which gives our non-English speakers that opportunity. And in playtime, there is a lot of Spanish that can go on and does go on through play. She also mentioned curriculum time can become stretched or too thin. And teaching 2 or 3 languages, especially when you're trying to do it in an even way amongst those 3, significantly reduces the time available for each. I mean, just from a mathematical point of view, at the moment we teach about 85% English. If we drop that down to 33, it's going to be very difficult to achieve a high academic standard in those languages at a young age, especially in reading and writing. And teachers often struggle to provide adequate support in spelling, grammar, composition, and this is especially true in languages that are complex, that have complex orthography like German, English or French. And often if you listen to secondary school teachers in international schools where there are focuses on several languages, one of the difficulties that they face is teaching books and understanding of literacy to a high level, because the children have not got that depth that is required to analyse poetry and analyse more complex literacy at the levels needed in all 3 languages. She also mentioned, and this is fundamental to Montessori philosophy, the increased parental burden, which can be incompatible with the Montessori philosophy. And in her previous school, she mentioned that parents often felt compelled to provide external tutoring or request homework for the languages to ensure proficiency in a particular language that are aligned with their child's future educational path. So when you go into a trilingual school, you go in with the idea that your child will come out with an amazing level in all 3 areas. And what tends to happen is, in actual fact, children will have their preferred languages, or language even. So one of the reasons we want to explain that we're focusing on English is because we don't want to sell you a false prophecy, whereby you think that your child is going to come out with an entirely trilingual program, obviously the children will come out with the language requirements that meet the homologation, but they will maybe not come out with all of the Spanish vocabulary that they would if or Catalan vocabulary in some of the areas of history or of certain areas of maths. So you need to be prepared that your child will have a stronger level of English than they will of Spanish or Catalan in certain areas. And what we don't want to do is have parents wanting to give young children a lot of homework to try and bring up those levels so that children are switching between the languages extremely fast and easy at a very young level. Experience from another member of our team, and I'm just going to read this. This is from a member of the team who's asked not to be named. In the early years of the programme at my former school, guides follow the natural development of each child, the natural language development of each child. Concepts were introduced in the official school language, English, only as the child became ready to comprehend them. And as a result, some children entered the primary programme with minimal English language skills. In the second plane of development in primary, Montessori offers the cosmic education, and this is developmentally aligned approach that introduces children to the universe through interconnected lessons, keys and explorations, which I showed you in the previous slide where you saw the circle. As one can imagine, offering a universe to a child means presenting a rich and expansive curriculum that nurtures curiosity, discovery and joy at each child's unique pace. While some children could navigate between languages with ease, especially those from bilingual households where each parent spoke a different language, others found the transition more difficult. While efforts were made to provide Montessori languages in both Montessori materials in both languages, the complexity and depth of the curriculum posed significant challenges. Children with learning difficulties or those from homes where neither parent spoke English faced particular obstacles. Given the school's goals of preparing children for an English-speaking middle school environment at age 12, offering all materials in both languages was not feasible without compromising the integrity of the curriculum. After years of trial, observation and reflection, the school made the decision to conduct the primary programme primarily in English, while offering second language instruction to meet national requirements. This shift also required families to consider their long-term goals, the language in which they envisioned their child thriving, and the cultural context in which they plan to live. Based on these considerations, families chose either to continue in the English Montessori track or transition elsewhere. So, after all of that of why we do what we do, I'm going to explain to you the reflection that we had in the administration meeting and with the teachers, and the discussions about what will change next year. So this year, you will know that we do a lot of songs in Catalan. You will probably be preparing for the cantata if you're a primary parent in the lower primary, or you will have heard the students singing songs at the winter celebration. And so those songs will continue in Catalan. And we have 20 minutes reading every day in English. We have levelled readers, the Oxford Reading Tree series in English only. And we have book reports in Catalan. So what will change next year? Well, we will have songs in Catalan and Spanish. We spoke with the Catalan and Spanish teachers about having a bigger focus on songs because we believe this will help our children who do not speak Spanish as a first language or Catalan as a first language to really get that basic vocabulary into their head. We will also use 2 days of the 20-minute reading slot to have 20 minutes reading per week in Spanish and Catalan for students who are already reading chapter books in English. Now, that does not mean that the second your child picks up a chapter book in English, we will start issuing them Spanish and Catalan reading books. But once the guide, your English-speaking guide, tells the Spanish and Catalan department that your child is ready, they will begin to read simple levelled readers in Spanish and Catalan. And this will involve them, once they are reading these books, to do book reports in Spanish and Catalan, because you know that now the book reports are only in Catalan. You may have seen them, and if you haven't seen them, you'll get them at the end of the year. And we will also be bringing in mystery reader. So we will be asking our Catalan and Spanish parents to come and read to our students in Catalan and Spanish. Now, in relation to the extra Spanish and Catalan classes, these are for children with a very basic introductory level, ones who perhaps have just arrived in the country and don't speak or understand any Spanish, or perhaps children who have got some bits of Spanish. Perhaps they studied it in their previous school in a different country, and they have a few words, or they have very high reading and writing skills in other languages. These are the classes that will be designed for newcomers to the city. If your child's been in the city for a while, but is still not yet speaking much Spanish or Catalan, we'll talk about that in a minute. But these are really designed for children who are very basic level. I want to make it clear that these are what we consider at school extra Spanish and Catalan classes. Like I said earlier, the school does not accept students who do not speak English. We always expect a minimum level for those students, and those who don't have quite the minimum level for any reason, perhaps they are slightly older but cannot read or write yet for whatever reason, we have extra classes that support those children. And the idea of these is similar. The teachers in the classroom for Spanish and Catalan will differentiate, but this is a way of helping your child get up to a higher level quicker. So they're support classes. Differentiation in the normal classes will still continue for those with the lower level. And the idea is that it supports students who need it without having to change the whole system of how the school works for those who do not, which is exactly what we do with students who come in with a lower level of English or reading or writing or maths or for any other level. We want to try to support those students, but we don't change the way the whole school works for that reason. And I want to make it clear that these classes are designed to be temporary. They're designed to last 1 to 3 terms, and they're small groups. We put a maximum of 8 students in the class, but really that would probably only be if we had an extremely high demand. The classes would be smaller with the idea that we can focus on those students and adapt even more the lessons to where they're at. For a temporary period of time, for between 1 to 3 terms. Also, to make it clear, the after-school Spanish classes will still exist, but with these there's a different focus, and we've seen how some children are enjoying these after-school Spanish classes, but these are designed to be slightly more intensive and very much more Montessori based. So what can we do for children who perhaps have been in the country for a while? Maybe they were born here, but they're still not speaking a lot in different languages. And at this point, I'm talking about primary age children. I'm not talking about our 0 to 6 child, although some of the techniques and some of the things I will mention will be relevant to that age group. So I'm sure you're aware children have different characteristics, and these characteristics can affect their language development. And there's 2 areas that I just want to mention. Obviously, shy children who are more shy and more nervous around other people, will find it more difficult to interact in different languages. Why? Because it will take them time to make friends, or time to get to know people well. And then if they have to do this in another language, that could slow them down even more. And then another type of child who may not be shy at all, maybe quite confident, but perhaps one who has quite high standards. One who expects a lot of themselves or a lot from other people. And if you observe your child, you might see this because they might tell other people off, they might criticize themselves physically or how they work. And a child like that is going to be more nervous or more aware when it comes to taking risks and not wanting to fail. And so this can affect how quickly a child is willing to start talking in another language or reading or writing. They will probably understand, but they might tell you that they don't understand. They might not respond to instructions. Even though they understand them, they might not respond because they don't want to make a mistake, because they're not 100% sure, because it's not something that comes completely naturally to them. And so these children will begin to respond and also to express their language development often more slowly than other peers. And then we can have emotional blockages that affect learning. Children who are more anxious might be more likely to be slower in their language development, as they're in their second language development, for the same reasons as a child who has high standards. They fear failure, or they're more nervous about making mistakes, or they're more nervous about something happening when they speak in the other language. And then, of course, we have our children with learning differences or difficulties. We know that autism can affect language expression. We also know that dyslexia affects language development, and that may affect a child's language development more in terms of the written or the writing part, but again, it depends on the age of the child. A child, as they get older, will become more aware of these differences and may have the idea that they're not so good at languages, and perhaps this translates to other languages that they could potentially speak. And then ADHD or ADD can also affect language development, and children might find it harder to focus, to listen to the second language, and if it requires a more conscious effort for them to learn it, then it will be more difficult. So what should we all be careful of? And here we've got a picture of a nice performing seal. Our children are not performing seals. We know that, and so therefore we need to be careful of the test. It's typical when our child can do something that we can't, that we might want to show off their skills, or we might want to check what they know. And you've probably heard parents say to their children, "Oh, tell me, how do you say book in French?" This is the test, isn't it? And it's actually surprisingly hard to translate words randomly. A lot of language that we speak is very context relevant. And so if we're suddenly asked to translate a word, or how do you say this in another language, if we're not speaking about something in that context, word retrieval is slower. And if we're somebody who has an anxiety of making mistakes, has anxiety or finds it hard to make mistakes, then that test can seem even worse. It's also important, like I mentioned before, to involve yourselves as a family with people who speak other languages, and to try to speak those languages. Friendship plays a huge part. Remember, the children are in the social period, so the social requirement of a second language is important for those children in order to want to speak it. We want to ease them in gently at school, but that social need needs to be there in order to want to play and to be able to wanting to use those languages. They say that we need about 500 words in order to speak a language, or to begin to speak a language. So children will often get by with even fewer and be able to interact with other children with less. But in order for them to want to speak it more regularly, or to be able to understand and respond to that language, we need to create that need in them. And this is maybe, and the next point, it means that you need to look perhaps more at yourself as a parent or parents, or those people around you. English speakers often have an anxiety around languages. When I first moved to Spain, I didn't speak any other language. I'd learned German at GCSE, and I'd not done especially well in French. So I didn't expect myself to learn Spanish at any point, really. And that anxiety we can pass on to our children if we don't face it. So perhaps part of facing our fears is to say, okay, this makes me really nervous, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to get myself in classes. And I wouldn't stop with just classes. You could do a language exchange. You could go out and meet people. There are plenty of activities on Meetup and various platforms like that, where you have the opportunity to go and meet with these people and practice the language. Equally, avoid mistake avoidance. When you go into a shop, you don't know what something is, you can try describing it in another language. You can look it up and try pronouncing it rather than asking Google Translate to say the word for you. All of these things show children that we're ready and able to make a mistake, and we're happy to try to get our point across. Equally, if you know you're only in Spain for a year or two, try to avoid the idea that we're going back soon. Talk about this as something where we may well stay if we really like it, even if you know your visa's going to run out. For children, for some children, it can be hard to make these friendships. And as we mentioned already, friendship plays a great deal in language learning. And so if your child's reluctant to make friends, the chances are they'll be reluctant to learn the language. And all of this can be explained. They can explain to themselves because they're going back soon, so they can avoid it. It's not something permanent, and therefore they don't need to stay. Then when we talk about others, it's important to not criticize other people's bad language skills. And I don't mean swearing. What I mean is maybe we have a grandpa who speaks really bad Spanish, or there's a friend of mummy's or daddy's who has been here 13 years and hardly speaks a word. All of these things, while we're not criticizing the child, what we're showing the child is that everybody is open to criticism and that people will criticize. So whilst you're not criticizing them, they may feel that they could be criticized. You are a critical person. And then finally, be aware of adult centricism. Adult centrism. We need to think that children don't see the world in the same way that we do. And things that are important to us are maybe not important to them. Maybe for them it is less important that they speak Spanish right now because they're busy making friends, they're learning how Montessori classroom works, they're busy learning a lot of other things and a lot of different topics, and Spanish is just to them one of them. And when they go around the city, they see that, we hardly need Spanish because a lot of places that we go and a lot of people we see don't speak Spanish. And maybe they have a few words and that for them is enough and they're not worried. And so also try to bear in mind that this is a journey for them that is not the same as your journey. Your language learning journey is not theirs, and they will live and experience this in a very different way to the adults around them. So what can you try? Well, like we mentioned already, create the need to learn, promote friendships with non-English speaking families. I would especially advise going outside of Barcelona and going to stay in some of the towns around Barcelona in the Pyrenees, and you will find that most people will address you in Catalan, and therefore you'll be speaking with non-English speakers. They might speak Spanish, but fewer and fewer people will speak English the further out of the city you go. You could also go to the library and get books out in other languages. Look at the pictures. You could try to read them. This always makes my children cringe, but it's a fun activity to motivate them to learn Catalan so that they don't have to listen to me read it. Then try to keep in mind, like I said, most people need about 500 words before we start to speak a language. And we have the silent period at that point. I don't know about you, when I first arrived to Barcelona, I would say my silent period lasted longer because it took me about 6 months just to work out when somebody was speaking Spanish and when somebody was speaking Catalan. Your children will be going through similar things. They might be trying to work out the difference between the two languages because they may be exposed to more Catalan than you are, or their parents are. So the silent period, in the 0 to 6, we say that it can last for 6 months to a year, where they won't appear to say much in Spanish or Catalan, and maybe they won't really respond much. And then from one day to the next, like I said, growth is not linear, and your child will suddenly begin to speak the other language. And finally, within that line, remember that a child will only learn when they feel comfortable. So we need to remove emotional blockages or be aware of them. If a child's just arrived in a new city, they will not necessarily feel comfortable straight away. They might need time to adjust to the different way the school works, the different way the city works. And so for them, learning and expressing that learning is going to be more difficult. And it also depends on which period the child is in. Particularly for our social children, when they're taking in a lot of new information, and if they're in the part where they are not expressing it much, it may take them longer before we see that language development come out. What you can try is to send the right message. And I think the message that we need to send around language learning is that communication and curiosity are more important than getting it right. And we send that message not only by saying it, but with our actions, with the way we interact with other people, and how we talk about the experiences that we live. And finally, model the behaviour. There's nothing like joining Spanish classes and beginning to speak Spanish with other people and your child seeing that. To see that, it's something that we really want to do. So, I suppose my take-home message today is we don't have the perfect solution for every individual, be that every individual, adult or child. There's a saying in Montessori that Montessori is for every child, but not necessarily for every family. And this is the way that as a school we have decided to address Spanish and Catalan. What we will do is work within the law and the Montessori principles, and we will constantly strive to keep the whole child at the centre of what we do. Thank you for your attention, and have a great day.